Very well, guys. So we're here inside of Photoshop to very quickly talk about the process, let's call it the theory process that I like to follow when I'm doing any kind of sculpting so that we can get the best possible result. And in a very similar way to how we talked about generating different like parts on our element when modeling, when sculpting, we also need to think about the different like shapes that we have. And we can divide them into three main categories. We can call them primary forms, secondary forms, and tertiary forms or details, okay? So the primary form will always be the silhouette, okay? So if we take a look at this right here, all of this, let's focus on this rocks right here. All of this silhouette and this like basic forms that we see, all of these basic angles and things, those are the primary forms that we're trying to capture when we're doing our sculpting inside of Blender. And the reason why primary forms are so important, I always like to use the cake analogy, is because primary forms make up the foundations of our elements. So if we don't have clean primary forms, then it doesn't matter how many secondary, tertiary forms we add, we're going to have a very bad sculpt. In the case of a character, for instance, when we're doing like the head, if we don't have the proper position for the nose, the mouth, the ears, and everything, if we don't have a good base mesh, then it doesn't matter how many wrinkles or pores or scars we add to the character, it's going to look bad and lumpy. So the primary forms are the basic shapes, such as like cubes, spheres, cones, like all of the primary forms that you can imagine, those would fall into the primary shape. Then, after the primary forms, we can start seeing some secondary shapes. And secondary shapes are like this interesting, like little, like cuts into the primary forms, okay? So imagine we have a big stone. I'm just gonna do like a big rock right here. Doing this big rock right here would be my primary form. And then the individual like facets or extra elements that we have on the rock, those would be the secondary forms. Finally, the tertiary forms are all of this like cracks, like wrinkles or like special elements that we have on the stone. Those are the details that we're going to see on top of the primary and secondary forms. And again, it's kind of like the decoration of a cake. If you don't have a good cake, if the bread sucks, if it's bad, then it doesn't matter how much frosting you add, the whole product is going to be a failure, right? Now that we understand this, again, primary forms, secondary forms, and tertiary forms, we can go back to Blender and we can continue to focus on the construction of them. So let's do a quick zoom here on the top part, and here's where we can really start going into this part. And you can see, for instance, the shadow and the light, how it catches this particular part, and it tells me that it has two sort of like planes to it. So I'm going to use my draw sharp right here, and I'm going to create the plane that we're missing right in this area. Now you can see that we need a little bit more resolution, so I'm going to control R to give myself a little bit more resolution, and if I need to, I might even go a little smaller than this to get even more detail. 200,000 polygons. That's way better. So with my clay tubes as well, clay strips, sorry, I'm gonna make my brush a little bit bigger, and I'm gonna start carving here to create this sort of effect where we can see the plane of this rock going in a little bit. Now this is symmetrical. You can see that there's another like break right there, so I'm gonna start carving in as well to create that new plane that we see on the rock. And then we can like bevel that one a little bit. We can use again our draw sharp, for instance, to start separating these pieces right there. The draw sharp definitely needs to be a lot smaller so we can have a little bit more control over the whole thing. Let's use now our flatten, sorry, the scrape brush, just kind of like trim dynamic to flatten all of this guys right here. Now, also another important factor about this process is I would recommend not focusing too much on the super tiny details, because remember, at the end of the day, this axe, we're going to be seeing it roughly at this distance with the whole thing. So people sometimes get too caught up on the specific side of things with the element, and that's also like, it's just from a production standpoint, it's just a waste of time, because you're going to be spending time on like a little pore that we have right here, when in reality you're never going to be seeing it at that distance. If you're going to have a shot where you're going to have a super close-up of the object, then yeah, you definitely need to take into account. Let's go back to the draw sharp and let's start separating the stone at that particular angle right there. And we can even use a smooth brush here to soften up some of the effects that we got there, like the tessellation that we start getting on those areas. At any point, you can just press Ctrl R again to recalculate, and that's also going to give us a different effect. Let's go again to the scrape brush. I'm gonna make the brush a little bit bigger, and I'm gonna use it to start creating the flat area of the rock on the back right here. Again, to give it this sort of rock feel. Later on, we're gonna be using some alphas as well to give this more texture. But for now, we're focusing on primary and secondary forms. Control R. And there we go. As you can see, that like this upper rock that we have right here starting to look really, really, really cool. Let's move on to the second one, this one. As you can see, there's a big like light area right here. That tells me that from a form perspective, there should be a flat area in here. So again, with the scrape brush, I'm gonna start cleaning up and flattening this area. I'm gonna make this a little bit sharper. And here's another brush that we haven't really used that much, but I think in this case it deserves an introduction, and that's the move brush. So the move brush is, or the grab brush right here, allows us to grab like a big part of the element and just like tweak it and move certain things around. So for instance, this stone, kind of want to have it a little bit more towards the center. So as you can see with the grab brush, I can just like push it and pull it. It's really good to do a big change on the shapes. So I strongly recommend that you use that one as well. We're gonna use the scrape brush now again, and we're gonna go into this area. The sculpting process, as I mentioned before, it's one of my favorite things to do in the 3D world. It's a very relaxing. I'm listening to some chill music right now. Of course, it's not being recorded. We don't want any copyright strike, but it's a very, very fun part of the process. I'm gonna go draw sharp, and you can see some like lines or indentations coming from the back. So with a small draw size, I'm gonna start creating that sort of like layering, blending it towards the front. Look at that. Now, I know that it looks a little bit weird, the fact that this is like perfectly symmetrical, but in games is very often the weapons will be symmetrically constructed so that we can save some like texture space on the maps. We're gonna talk about that later as well. There we go. So that will be like the third stone. And then the fourth stone is a really fun one because we got this very thin line going down, another plane right here, and then the big stone right here. So I'm gonna go back to my clay strips. I'm gonna fill in a little bit of this area because we need a little bit more mass. I'm gonna use Control to remove a little bit there, and we can find this one right here coming from the very, very top. So draw sharp, and we're gonna have a line coming down and generating this like big chunk right here. The big chunk is a lot flatter here on the front, as you can see. So again, with the scrape brush, we're gonna start like pushing it in to generate this sort of like flat shape. There we go. We can go back to clay strips, make them a little bit smaller, and start creating this sort of like lines to indicate the layering that we're kind of like building up here with the elements. I'm doing both positive and negative layers here. So I'm adding and I'm removing volume to create this interesting intersection. I'm gonna remove a little bit more here because that's sort of like the flat effect that we're looking for. Let's use the scrape brush again to flatten these areas right there. Go. Now you can see we're getting a little bit of a weird effect right there. Again, clay strips. Just fill that in a little bit and go back to scrape and clean up that area. Not bad, right? There we go. Again, don't worry about the symmetry. I know it looks very, very weird from the symmetry side, but you got to remember that this is a weapon, so we're expecting to have a little bit of that. Let's go again to draw sharp. Make this a lot smaller. And we're going to start carving it. Very important here. Look at this. Let me go to Photoshop so that you can see it a little bit clearer. So in this area, we have a silhouette that it pushes back. So this like shelf, oh, cancel. That shelf that we see right there, this one, that's the kind of stuff that we need to capture in the silhouette. If we keep it like this, it's going to look very bad, very wonky. So I'm going to use clay strips again. And I'm going to start removing to create a really nice and sharp transition there that's gonna indicate the shelf. And then that shelf that was just created there, with the scrape brush, we can really tighten it, make it really intense like that, so that it really looks like we're making a jump from one rock to another. And then we can even go with the draw sharp and really separate the rocks right there. The sculpting process is something that's very interesting to me, because a lot of people are scared about the fact that we have a lot of brushes and a lot of options, both in Blender and in ZBrush. But the thing is, you usually are gonna be using only a few. Yes, there's a lot of tips and tricks and techniques and secrets that you can use to generate certain effects, but more often than not, you're gonna be using like the traditional sculpting brushes. So don't worry too much about that one. Now here, I do want to give the impression that this thing is like carved in, and right now the transition looks very clean. So again, I'm going to use the clay buildup with a small effect. And I'm just going to create a little bit of roughness there on the border of the merge with the handle. So it looks a little bit more organic, right? Like I don't want to have like a super clean cut. So even that, I know that we are getting a little bit away from the concept, but that's again, in my personal professional experience, art directors like when you innovate on something. Of course, you should always ask for their permission and for if they agree with the changes that you're proposing. But as long as you have a good justification for it, it's usually a good idea to make things look even better. So there we go. Not bad, right? Not freaking bad. Let's flatten this a little bit more. Again, for instance, that line, I don't like it, so I'm just going to use my grab brush. I'm just going to push that in so we get a flatter effect. So it's a combination of draw sharp, scrape, graph, clay strips. Like we're using a little bit of everything to generate this very cool effect. And you can see the difference, right? If I were to open, I haven't saved another copy of this one, by the way, which I should. So I'm gonna go File, Save As. Let's do plus. There we go, save. So if we were to open the first version, where we only had the initial like cylinder that we extruded, that will be really, like you can see the difference, right? Like you can see how much more detail we can get out of this piece by just adding this thing. If we go to the reimage, you can see we're at 0.003. We can still go a little bit lower, and we're probably going to do that in the next part when we start adding more details. But for now, I'm going to stop the video, and in the next one, we'll continue working on these areas. Now, I know that sculpting can be a little bit slow, so if you feel like you understand these principles and you want to skip a little bit ahead, then that's perfectly fine. The next video is just going to be more of this like basic shapes. I will tackle this like lower parts of the element, and after that we'll go into the tertiary details, so all of like the crevices and things like that. So yeah, hang on tight, and I'll see you back on the next one.